Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, An Inquiry into Values, by Robert M. Persig. Chapter 19. A mat of sunlit pine needles by my face slowly tells me where I am and helps me dispel a dream. In the dream I was standing in a white-painted room looking in a glass door. On the other side was Chris and his brother and mother. Chris was waving at me from the other side of the door, and his brother was smiling, but his mother had tears in her eyes. And when I saw that Chris's smile was fixed and artificial and actually there was deep fear. I moved toward the door, and his smile became better. He motioned for me to open it. I was about to open it, but then didn't. His fear came back, but I turned and walked away. It's a dream that has occurred often before. Its meaning is obvious, and it fits some thoughts of last night. He's trying to relate to me, and is afraid he never will. Things are getting clearer up here. Beyond the flap of the tent now, the needles on the ground send vapors of mist up toward the sun. The air feels moist and cool. While Chris sleeps, I get out of the tent carefully and stand up and stretch. My legs and back are stiff but not painful. I do calisthenics for a few minutes to loosen them up, then sprint from the knoll into the pines. That feels better. The pine odor is heavy and moist this morning. I squat and look down at the morning mist in the canyon below. Later I return to the tent, where a noise indicates that Chris is awake. And when I look inside and see his face, I see his face stare around silently. He's a slow waker, and it'll be about 5 minutes before his mind warms up to the point where he can speak. Now he squints into the light. "Good morning," I say. No answer. A few raindrops fall down from the pines. "Did you sleep well?" "No." "That's too bad." "How come you're up so early?" he asks. "It's not early." "What time is it?" 9 o'clock, I say. "I bet we didn't go to sleep until 3. 3? If he stayed awake, he's going to pay for it today." "Well, I got to sleep," I say. He looks at me strangely. "You kept me awake." "Me?" "Talking." "In my sleep, you mean?" "No, about the mountain." Something is odd here. "I don't know anything about a mountain, Chris." "Well, you talked all night about it. You said at the top of the mountain we'd see everything. You said you were going to meet me there." I think he's been dreaming. "How could I meet you there when I'm already with you?" "I don't know. You said it." He looks upset. "You sounded like you were drunk or something." He's still half asleep. I'd better let him wake up peacefully. But I'm thirsty, and remember I left the canteen behind, thinking we'd find enough water as we traveled. Dumb. There'll be no breakfast now until we're up over the ridge and far down to the other side, where we can find a spring. We'd better pack up and go, I say, if we're going to get some water for breakfast. It's already warm and probably will not be as hot this afternoon. It's already warm out and probably will be hot this afternoon. The tent comes down easily, and I'm pleased to see that everything stayed dry. In a half hour, we're packed. Now, except for beaten down grass and area looks as if no one had been here. We still have a lot of climbing to do, but on the trail we discover it's easier than yesterday. We're getting to the rounded upper portion of the ridge, and the slope isn't as steep. It looks as though the pines have never been cut here. All direct light is shut from the forest floor, and there's no underbrush at all. Just a springy floor of needles that's open and spacious and easy hiking. Time to get on with the Chautauqua and the second wave of crystallization, the metaphysical one. This was brought about in response to Phaedrus' wild meanderings about quality. When the English faculty at Bozeman, informed of their squareness, presented him with a reasonable question. "Does this undefined quality of yours exist in the things we observe?" they asked, "or is it subjective, existing only in the observer?" It was a simple, normal enough question, and there was no hurry for an answer. There was no need for hurry. It was a finisher offer, a knockdown question, a haymaker, a Saturday night special, the kind you don't recover from. Because if quality exists in the object, then you must explain why scientific instruments are unable to detect it. You must suggest instruments that will detect it, or live with the explanation that instruments don't detect it because your whole quality concept, to put politely, is a large pile of nonsense. On the other hand, if quality is subjective, existing only in the observer, then this quality that you make much of it you make, then this quality that you make so much of is just a fancy name for whatever you like. What Phaedrus had been presented with by the faculty of English department at Montana State College was an ancient logical construct known as a dilemma. A dilemma, which is a Greek word for two premises, has been likened to the front end of an angry and charging bull. If he accepts the premise that quality was objective, he was impaled on one horn of the dilemma. If he accepted the other premise that quality was subjective, he was impaled on the other horn. Either quality is objective or subjective, therefore he was impaled no matter how he answered. He noticed that from a number of faculty members he was receiving some good-natured smiles. Phaedrus, however, because of his training in logic, was aware that every dilemma affords not two but three classic refutations, and he also knew of a few that weren't so classic, so he smiled back. He could take the left horn and refute the idea that objectivity implied scientific detectability, or he could take the right horn and refute the idea that subjectivity implies anything you like, or he could go between the horns and deny that subjectivity and objectivity were the only choices. You may be sure he tested out all three. In addition to these three classical logical refutations, there are some illogical rhetorical ones. Phaedrus, being a rhetorician, had these available too. One may throw sand in the bull's eyes. He had already done this with his statement that lack of knowledge of equality constitutes incompetence. He had already done this with his statement that lack of knowledge of equality constitutes incompetence. It was an old rule of logic that the competence of the speaker has no relevance to the truth of what he says, and so talk of incompetence was pure sand. The world's biggest fool can say the sun is shining, but that doesn't make it dark out. Socrates, that ancient enemy of the rhetorical argument, would have sent Phaedrus flying for this one, saying, "Yes, I accept your premise that I am incompetent on the matter of quality. Now please show an incompetent old man what quality is. Otherwise, how do I improve?" Phaedrus would have been allowed to stew around for a few minutes, and then been flattened with questions that proved he didn't know what quality was either, and was, by his own standards, incompetent. One may attempt to sing the bull to sleep. Phaedrus could have told his questions that the answer to this dilemma was beyond his humble powers of solution, but the fact that he couldn't find an answer was no logical proof that the answer couldn't be found. Wouldn't they, with their broader experience, try to help him find an answer? But it was way too late for lullabies like that. They could simply have replied, "No, we're way too square, and until you come up with an answer, stick to the syllabus, so that we don't have to flunk out your mixed-up students when we get the next quarter." The third rhetorical narrative was to the dilemma, and the best one, in my opinion, was to refuse to enter the arena. Phaedrus could simply have said, "The attempt to classify quality as subjective or objective and an attempt to define it. The attempt to classify quality as subjective or objective is an attempt to define it. I have already said that it is undefinable," and left it at that. I believe Deluses actually counseled him to do this at the time. Why he chose to disregard this advice and chose to respond to this dilemma logically and dialectically rather than take the easy escape of mysticism, I don't know, but I can guess. I think first of all that he felt the whole Church of Reason was irreversibly in the arena of logic, and when one put oneself outside the logical disputation, one put oneself outside any academic consideration whatsoever. Philosophical mysticism, the idea that truth is indefinable and can be apprehended only by non-rational means, has been with us since the beginning of history, is the basis of Zen practice, but it's not an academic subject. The Academy, the Church of Reason, is concerned exclusively with things that can be defined, and if one wants to be a mystic, his place is on the monastery, not the university. Universities are places where things should be spelled out. I think a second reason for his decision to enter the arena was an egoistic one. He knew himself to be a pretty sharp logician and a dialectician, took pride in this, and looked upon the present dilemma as a challenge to his skill. I think of how that trace of egotism may have been the beginning of all his troubles. I see a deer move about 200 yards ahead above us through the pines. I try to point it out to Chris, but by the time he looks, it's gone. The first horn of Phaedrus' dilemma was, if quality exists in the object, why can't scientific instruments detect it? This horn was the mean one. From the start, he saw how deadly it was. If he was going to presume to be some super scientist who could see an object's quality that no scientist could detect, he was just proving himself to be a nut or a fool or both. In today's world, ideas that are incompatible with scientific knowledge don't get off the ground. He remembered Locke's statement that no object, scientific or otherwise, is knowable except in terms of its qualities. This irrefutable truth seemed to suggest that the reason scientists cannot detect quality in objects is because quality is all they detect. The object is an intellectual construct deduced from the qualities. This answer, if valid, certainly smashed the first horn of the dilemma, and for a while excited him greatly. But it turned out to be false. The quality that he and the students had been seeing in the classroom was completely different from the qualities of color or heat or hardness observed in the laboratory. Those physical properties were all measurable with instruments. His quality, excellence, worth, goodness, was not a physical property and was not measurable. He had been thrown off by an ambiguity in the term quality. He wondered why that ambiguity should exist. Made a mental note to do some digging into the historic roots of the word quality, then put it aside. The horn of the dilemma was still there. He turned his attention to the other horn of the dilemma, which showed more promise of refutation. He thought, so quality is whatever you like? It angered him. The great artists of history, Raphael, Beethoven, Michelangelo, they were all just putting out what people liked. They had no goal other than to titillate the senses in a big way. Was that it? It was angering. And what was most angering about it was that he couldn't see any immediate way to cut it up logically. So he studied the statement carefully, in the same reflective way he always studied things before attacking them. Then he saw it. He brought out the knife and exercised just one word to create the entire angering effect of that sentence. The word was just. Why should quality be just what you like? Why should what you like be just? What did just mean in any case? When separated out like this for independent examination, it became apparent that just, in this case, really didn't mean a damn thing. It was a purely pejorative term, whose logical contribution to the sentence was nil. Now that the word was removed, the sentence became quality is what you like, and its meaning was entirely changed. It had become an innocuous truism. He wondered why that statement had angered him so much in the first place. It had seemed so natural. Why had it taken so long to see that what it really said was what you like is bad, or at least inconsequential? What was behind the smug presumption that pleased you was bad, or at least unimportant in comparison to other things? It seemed that the quintessence of the squareness he was fighting, little children. It seemed the quintessence of the squareness he was fighting. Little children who were trained not to do just what they liked, but what? Of course, what others liked. And which others? Parents, teachers, supervisors, policemen, judges, officials, kings, dictators, all authorities. When you are trained to despise just what you like, then, of course, you become a much more obedient servant of others, a good slave. And when you learn to not just do what you like, then the system loves you. But suppose you do just what you like. Does that mean you're going to go out and shoot heroin, rob banks, and rape old ladies? The person who is counseling you not to do just as you like is making some remarkable presumptions about what is likable. He seems unaware that people may not rob banks because they have considered the consequences and decided they don't like to. He doesn't see that banks exist in the first place because they're just what people like, namely, providers of loans. Phaedrus began to wonder how all this condemnation of what you like ever seemed such a natural objection in the first place. Soon he saw there was much more of this he had been aware of. When people said, don't do just what you like, they didn't just mean obey authority. They also meant something else. This something else opened up into a huge area of classic scientific belief, which stated that what you like is unimportant because it's all composed of irrational emotions within yourself. He studied this argument for a long time, then knifed it into two smaller groups, which he called scientific materialism and classic formalism. He said there are two, the two are often found associated in the same person, but logically are separate. Scientific materialism, which is commoner among lay followers of science, than among scientists themselves, holds that what is composed of matter or energy is measurable by the instruments of science is real. Anything else is unreal, or at least of no importance. What you like is immeasurable and therefore unreal. What you like can be a fact or it can be a hallucination. Liking does not distinguish between the two. The whole purpose of scientific method is to make valid distinctions between the false and the true in nature, to eliminate the subjective, unreal, imaginary elements from one's work, so as to obtain an objective, true picture of reality. Then he said quality was subjective. When he said quality was subjective, to them he was just saying that quality is imaginary, and therefore he disregarded in any serious consideration of reality. On the other hand is classic formalism, which insists what isn't understood intellectually isn't understood at all. Quality, in this case, is unimportant because it's an emotional understanding accompanied by the intellectual elements of reason. Of these two main sources of that epithet, just, Phaedrus felt that the first, scientific materialism, was by far the easiest to cut into ribbons. This, he knew from his earlier education, was naive science. He went after it first, using the reductio ad absurdum. This form of argument rests on the truth that if the inevitable conclusions from a set of premises are absurd, then it follows logically that at least one of the premises that produce them is absurd. Let's examine, he said, what follows from the premise that anything's not composed of mass energy is unreal or unimportant. He used the number 0 as a starter. 0, originally a Hindu number, was introduced to the West by the Arabs during the Middle Ages, and was unknown to the ancient Greeks and Romans. How was that, he wondered? Had nature so subtly hidden 0 that all the Greeks and all the Romans, millions of them, couldn't find it? One would normally think that 0 was right out there in the open for everyone to see. He showed the absurdity of trying to derive 0 from any form of mass energy, and then asked, rhetorically, if that meant that the number 0 was unscientific. If so, did that mean that the digital computers which function exclusively in terms of ones and zeros should be limited to just ones for scientific works? No trouble finding the absurdity here. He then went on with the other scientific concepts, one by one, showing that they could not possibly exist independently of subjective considerations. He ended up with the law of gravity, in an example I gave John and Sylvia and Chris in the first night of our trip. If subjectivity is eliminated as an unimportant, he said, then the entire body of science must be eliminated with it. This refutation of scientific materialism, however, seemed to put him in the camp of philosophic idealism. Berkeley, Hume, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, Bradley, Bosanquet, good company all, logical to the last comma, but so difficult to justify in common sense language that this seemed to burden to him in his defense of quality rather than an aid. The argument that the world was all mind might be a sound logical position, but it was clearly not a sound rhetorical one. It was way too tedious and difficult for the course in freshman composition, too far-fetched. At this point, the whole subjective horn of the dilemma looked almost as uninspiring as the objective one, and the arguments of classical formalism, when he started to examine them, made it even worse. These were extremely forceful arguments that you shouldn't respond to your immediate emotional impulses without considering the big rational picture. Kids are told, don't spend your whole allowance for bubblegum, immediate emotional impulse, because you're going to want to spend it for something else later, big picture. Adults are told, this paper may smell awful even when the best controls immediate actions. This paper mill may smell awful even with the best controls immediate actions. But without it, the economy of the whole town will collapse, big picture. In terms of your old dichotomy, what's being said is, don't base your decisions on romantic surface appeal without considering classical underlying form. This was something we kind of agreed with. What the classical formalists meant um, objection quality is what you like was that this subjective, undefined quality he was teaching was just romantic surface appeal. Classroom popularity contests could determine whether a composition had immediate appeal, alright, but was this quality? Was quality something that you just see, or might it be something more subtle than that, so that you wouldn't see it at all immediately, but only after a long period of time? The more he examined this argument, the more formidable it appeared. This looked like the one that might do in his whole thesis. What made it so ominous was that it seemed to answer a question that had arisen often in class, which he always had to answer somewhat somewhat casuistically. This was the question: if everyone knows what quality is, why is there such a disagreement about it? His casuist answer had been that although pure quality was the same for everyone, the objects that people said quality adhered in varied from person to person. So long as he left quality undefined, there was no way to argue with this. But he knew the students knew, that it had the smell of falseness about it. It didn't really answer the question. Now there was an alternative explanation. People disagreed about quality because some just used their immediate emotions, whereas others applied their overall knowledge. He knew that in any popularity contest among English teachers, this latter argument, which bolstered their authority, would win overwhelming endorsement. But this argument was completely devastating. Instead of one single uniform quality, there now appeared to be two qualities: a romantic one, just seeing, which the students had, and a classic one, overall understanding, which the teachers had. A hip one and a square one. Squareness was not the absence of quality, it was the classic quality. Hipness was not the presence of quality, it was the more romantic quality. The hip-square cleavage he discovered was still there, but quality didn't now seem to fall entirely on one side of the cleavage, as he previously supposed. Instead, quality itself cleaved into two kinds, one on each side of the cleavage line. His simple, neat, beautiful, undefined quality was starting to get complex. He didn't like the way this was going. The cleavage term that was going to unify the classic and romantic ways of looking at things had itself been cleaved into two parts and could no longer unify anything. It had been caught in an analytic meat grinder. The knife of subjectivity and objectivity had cut quality into two and killed it as a working concept. If he was going to save it, he couldn't let that knife get it. And really, the quality he was talking about wasn't classic quality or romantic quality. It was beyond both of them, and by God, it wasn't subjective or objective either. It was beyond both of those categories. Actually, his whole dilemma of subjectivity and objectivity, of mind-matter with relationship to quality, was unfair. That mind-matter relationship has been on an intellectual hang-up for centuries. They were just putting that hang-up on top of quality to drag quality down. How could he say whether quality was mind or matter when there was no logical clarity as to what was mind and what was matter in the first place? And so he rejected the left horn. Quality is not objective, he said. It doesn't reside in the material world. Then he rejected the right horn. Quality is not subjective, he said. It does not reside merely in the mind. And finally, Phaedrus, following a path that to his knowledge had never been taken before in the history of Western thought, went straight between the horns of the subjectivity-objectivity dilemma, and said quality is neither a part of mind nor is a part of matter. It is a third entity which is independent of the two. He was heard along the corridors and up and down the stairs of Montana Hall, singing softly to himself, almost under his breath, "Holy, holy, holy, blessed Trinity." And there was a faint fragment of memory, possibly wrong, possibly just something I'm imagining, that says he just let the whole thought structure sit like that for weeks without carrying it any farther. Chris shouts, "When are we going to get to the top?" "Probably quite a way yet," I reply. "Will we see a lot?" "I think so. Look for blue skies between the trees. As long as we can't see the sky, we know it's a way yet. The light will come through the trees when we get round to the top." Last night's rain has soaked the soft duff of needles sufficiently to make them good walking. Sometimes, when it's really dry on the slope, like this, they become slippery and you have to dig your feet into them edgewise or just lie down. I say to Chris, "Isn't it great when there's no underbrush like this?" "Why isn't there any?" he asked. "I think this area must never have been logged. When a forest is left alone like this for centuries, the trees shut out all the underbrush." "It's like a park," Chris says. You can sure see all around." His mood seems much better than yesterday, and I think he'll be a good traveler from here on. This forest silence improves anyone. The world now, according to Phaedrus, is composed of three things: mind, matter, and quality. The fact that he had established no relationship between them didn't bother him at first. If the relationship between mind and matter had been fought over for centuries and wasn't yet resolved, why should he, in a matter of a few weeks, come along with something conclusive about quality? So he let it go. He put it up on a kind of mental shelf where he put all kinds of questions he had no immediate answers for. He knew the metaphysical trinity of subject, object, and quality would sooner or later be interrelated, but he was in no hurry about it. It was just so satisfying to be beyond the danger of those horns that he relaxed and enjoyed it as long as he could. Eventually, however, he examined it more closely. Although there's no logical objection to a metaphysical trinity, a three-headed reality, such trinities are not common or popular. The metaphysician normally seeks out either monism such as God, which explains the nature of the world as a manifestation of one single thing, or he seeks dualism, such as mind-matter, which explains it as two things, or he leaves it as pluralism, which explains it as a manifestation of an indefinite number of things. But 3 is an awkward number. Right away you want to know, why 3? What's the relationship among them? And as the need for relaxation diminished, Phaedrus became curious about this relationship too. He noted that although normally you associate quality with objects, feelings of quality sometimes occur without any object at all. This is what led him at first to think that maybe quality was all subjective. But subjective pleasure wasn't what he meant by quality either. Quality decreases subjectivity. Quality takes you out of yourself, makes you aware of the world around you. Quality is opposed to subjectivity. I don't know how much thought passed before he arrived at this, but eventually he saw that quality couldn't be independently related with either subject or the object, but could be found only in the relationships of the two with each other. At this point, at the point which subject and object meet. That sounded warm. Quality is not a thing, it's an event. Warmer. It is the event at which the subject becomes aware of the object. And because without objects there can be no subject, because the objects create the subject's awareness of himself. Quality is at the event at which awareness of both subjects and objects is made possible. Hot. Now he knew it was coming. This means that quality was not just the result of a collision between subject and object. The very existence of subject and object themselves is deduced from the quality event. The quality event is the cause of the subjects and objects, which are then mistakenly presumed to be the cause of the quality. Now he had that whole damned evil dilemma by the throat, the dilemma that all the time had his unseen vile presumption in it, for which there was no logical justification. That quality was the effect of the subjects and objects. It was not. He brought out his knife. The sun of quality, he wrote, does not revolve around the objects and the objects of our existence. It does not passively illuminate them. It is not subordinate to them in any way. It has created them. They are subordinate to it. And at that point, when he wrote that, he knew he had reached some kind of culmination of thought he had been unconsciously striving for over a long period of time. "Blue sky," shouts Chris. And there it is, way above us, a narrow patch of blue through the trunks of the trees. We move faster, and the patches of blue become larger and larger through the trees. Soon we see that the trees thin out to a bare spot at the summit. When the summit is about 50 yards away, I say, "Let's go," and start to dash for it, throwing into the effort of all reserves of energy I've been saving. I give it everything I have, but Chris gains on me, and then he passes me, giggling. With the heavy load and the high altitude, we're not setting any records, but now we're just charging up with all we have. Chris gets there first. While I just break out of the trees, he raises his arm and shouts, "The winner!" Egotist. I'm breathing so hard when I arrive I can't speak. We just drop our packs from our shoulders and lie down against some rocks. But the crust of the ground is dry from the sun, but the underneath is mud from last night's rain. Below us and miles away, beyond the forest slopes and the fields beyond them, is the Gallatin Valley. At one corner of the valley is Bozeman. A grasshopper jumps from the rocks and soars down and away from us over the trees. We made it, Chris says. He is very happy, and I am still too winded to answer. I take off my boots and socks, which are soggy as sweat, and set them to dry on a rock. And I stare at them meditatively, as vapors from them rise toward the sun.